The fourth move. The sound of the old man's pawn clicking onto the square was barely audible, yet it silenced the entire park. The flutter of pigeon wings, the laughter of children, the ceaseless hum of the city, it all vanished. The international Grandmaster stared in horror, realizing the quiet old man he had just mocked hadn't just said checkmate, he had, with 4 simple moves, dismantled his entire career and the arrogance that built it. Welcome to Untold Tales. Before we begin this powerful story of a quiet park bench and a secret Cold War, tell us in the comments, from which city are you watching this video today? And if you believe that the quietest minds are often the most dangerous, hit that subscribe button and help us share the stories that matter. In the very heart of the city, there was a green oasis where the ambitious shadows of skyscrapers could not reach. A place where the relentless pace of life seemed to slow to a gentle stroll. Central Park. And within this oasis, tucked into the southwest corner under the protective canopy of ancient oak trees, lay a hollowed ground reserved for the players of chess. It was an open-air club of concrete and marble tables, a silent battlefield that every day brought together the city's most colorful and unexpected minds. Fast-talking Wall Street brokers, weathered Vietnam veterans still fighting old wars on a checkered board, university students escaping their lectures, and retirees who measured their days in moves and counter-moves. All were equal in the black and white universe of these 64 squares. Amidst this organized chaos, there was one man who occupied the same bench at the same table every single day. Arthur, a man in his late 70s with slightly stooped shoulders and a face like a riverbed of deep lines, he was a creature of serene habit. He always wore a clean but well-worn tweed jacket and a faded flat cap that seemed a permanent part of him. Arthur was a fixture of the chess corner, as much a part of the landscape as the trees themselves. He would arrive each afternoon, take out his worn ivory-colored chess pieces from their wooden box, each one smoothed and polished by decades of touch, set them up with painstaking care, and quietly wait for an opponent. By all accounts, Arthur was not a good player, at least that was the consensus. He usually played against the quick, aggressive youths, and, almost without fail, he would lose. But there was a quiet dignity in his defeats. He never grew frustrated, never lamented a bad move. Upon being checkmated, he would simply offer a gentle smile, extend a hand to his opponent, and say, "A fine game, young man. I learned something new from you today." For the younger players, he was the perfect adversary. Gentle, harmless, and an easy win, a perfect boost to their confidence. He was just old Arthur, the friendly loser. The usual peaceful atmosphere of the chess corner was shattered that day by an event akin to a circus coming to town. The world-renowned Russian Grandmaster Maxim Volkov had arrived as part of a promotional tour to play a demonstration match. Volkov was not just a chess player, he was a phenomenon. At only 30 years old, with sharp features, ice blue eyes, and a tailored Italian suit that seemed out of place yet perfectly natural on him, he was the rock star of the chess world. Flanked by a small entourage of assistants and a throng of journalists, Volkov swept into the chess area, and all other games immediately ceased. The park's regulars gathered around, eager to catch a glimpse of this living god of chess. Basking in the adoring gazes and the flash of cameras, Volkov sat at the central table. "So," he announced, his voice carrying a condescending theatricality, "who shall have the honor of testing their intellect against me today?" A few brave souls stepped forward. The park's undisputed top player, a stockbroker known for his lightning-fast calculations, was dispatched in 12 moves, with Volkov barely seeming to pay attention. Next came a wily retired colonel, famous for his cunning, unorthodox traps. Volkov saw the trap coming 3 moves before it was set, turned it against the colonel, and checkmated him in 8 moves. After each victory, a conqueror's smile would spread across his face as he scanned the crowd. Who is the next victim? In less than an hour, he had systematically and effortlessly crushed the 10 best players the park had to offer, spending less than a minute of total thought time. He was on an entirely different plane of existence, and he reveled in it. Finally, a hush fell over the crowd. There was no one left who dared to challenge him. Volkov, savoring his triumph, leaned back in his chair, a king surveying his conquered territory. His gaze swept over the silent, intimidated faces, and then settled on a figure at the edge of the crowd, seemingly untouched by the spectacle. It was old Arthur, who had been sitting quietly on his usual bench, sipping tea from a thermos, watching the proceedings with a placid, almost detached curiosity. "Hey, you!" Volkov called out, his voice booming across the quiet space. "The old man in the cap, you're not playing, or are you afraid?" A ripple of nervous chuckles went through the crowd. Everyone knew Arthur. Pitting him against the Grandmaster would be like sending a lamb to a slaughterhouse. It felt less like a game and more like a public humiliation. Arthur slowly raised his head, his calm eyes meeting the Grandmaster's fiery gaze. He offered a gentle, self-deprecating smile. "I only play for pleasure, sir. I am not in your league," he said, his voice soft but clear. This humble refusal only served to fuel Volkov's arrogance. A quick, brutal victory over this seemingly frail old man would be the perfect final flourish to his performance. "Nonsense," he declared. "Chess is not played for pleasure. It is played for intellectual domination. Come, let me give you a free lesson so your retirement isn't so dull." The crowd, sensing the impending drama, began to murmur and urge Arthur forward. This would be the final, tragic-comic act of the show. With a gentle sigh, as if he could no longer resist the pointless insistence of the world, Arthur shrugged his shoulders. He slowly got to his feet, leaning on his simple wooden cane, and made his way to the chair opposite Volkov. He opened his wooden box and, with his usual meticulous care, began to set up his worn, ivory-colored pieces. Volkov drummed his fingers on the table impatiently, a predator eager to finish off his final easy prey. He was already thinking about his dinner reservations. "You can have the white pieces, old man," Volkov said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Let's get this over with quickly." A deep silence fell over the park once more. Every eye was fixed on Arthur, expecting his usual, predictably weak opening move. Arthur raised a slightly trembling hand and pushed the pawn in front of his king forward, but only a single square, from E2 to E3. It was an incredibly passive, almost cowardly opening. The Vant Cruz opening. In the world of competitive chess, it was considered a joke, a move used by beginners who didn't know any better. When Volkov saw the move, he couldn't suppress a loud laugh. "Seriously? That's your opening? Did your grandmother teach you that one?" he asked, playing to the crowd. Without a moment's thought, he responded with the most standard and aggressive countermove possible: pawn to D5. The move immediately seized control of the center and was designed to punish the old man's passive play instantly. The turn was Arthur's again. Everyone expected him to go on the defensive, to try and protect his pawn. But Arthur did something startling. He moved his bishop from F1 to C4, a completely undefended square. The move made no logical sense. The bishop was now a free piece, a gift that Volkov could easily take on his next turn. The smile on Volkov's face faded. He narrowed his eyes. Was this a beginner's blunder, or was it some kind of trap he had never seen before? No, that was impossible. What could this old man possibly know? It was an obvious mistake, and Maxim Volkov never forgave mistakes. He played his knight from b8 to c6, both developing his piece and directly threatening the foolishly placed bishop. The game, he thought, was already over. He would take the bishop, dismantle the old man's clumsy defense, and checkmate him in 5 more moves. This was the critical moment of the game. Arthur had to save his bishop. Every instinct, every rule of chess screamed for him to retreat the endangered piece to a safe square. The crowd watched, some with pity, others with morbid curiosity, waiting for the inevitable defensive move. But Arthur did not retreat. Instead, in a move that defied all logic and reason, he moved his knight from g1 to f3. This move not only developed his knight, but, more shockingly, it completely abandoned the bishop to its fate. It was a sacrifice with no apparent compensation, a strategic blunder of the highest order. Volkov stared at the board, his mind racing. He had built his career on his ability to see dozens of moves ahead, to calculate every possible permutation. But this was not calculation. This was chaos. It couldn't be a trap. There was no conceivable strategic advantage to be gained from such a move. He scanned the board again, looking for any hidden threat, any subtle positional gain for his opponent. There was nothing. The only possible explanation was that the old man was simply senile, making random, meaningless moves. Convinced that he was not facing a hidden strategy but a series of pathetic blunders, Volkov let his arrogance take over completely. A cruel, triumphant smile spread across his face. "Thank you for the bishop," he murmured, his voice dripping with condescension. With a swift, confident motion, he moved his knight from c6, capturing the free bishop on c4. The piece was removed from the board with a dismissive flick of his wrist. He had taken the bait. The steel jaws of a trap decades in the making were now swinging shut. He leaned back in his chair, already savoring the taste of his effortless, humiliating victory. He was not just playing a game, he was teaching a lesson, proving the unassailable superiority of his intellect. He was so focused on the piece he had just won that he failed to see the fatal geometry that had just formed on the board. And in that moment of supreme arrogance, the trap was sprung. A single, clear voice cut through the silence of the park. It was Arthur's, calm, precise, and as final as a judge's verdict. Checkmate. Volkov looked up from the board, his eyes wide with disbelief. What? What nonsense are you talking about? Arthur did not reply. He simply pointed a steady, wrinkled finger at the board. Volkov's ice-blue eyes snapped back to the game. And he saw it. Arthur's final knight move had not been a simple sacrifice. It had been a masterful diversion. While Volkov was focused on the bishop, the knight had moved to a square that, in conjunction with the seemingly passive pawn on e3, controlled all of the king's escape squares. And now, with the path cleared, Arthur's queen, which had sat dormant on d1 for the entire game, had a clear, unobstructed line to h5. Queen to h5, a direct, unblockable, and fatal threat to Volkov's king. The king had nowhere to run. No piece could intercept the queen, no piece could capture her. It was impossible. It was a variation of the Legal trap, a theoretical curiosity known to most masters. But this was different. This variation was not in any chess book. It was a phantom, a whisper from the Cold War. It was the Siberian variation, a devastatingly effective modification rumored to have been developed by Soviet intelligence, but never used in a public game. Its only counter was to recognize the danger of the very first passive pawn move and respond with an unorthodox defense. But arrogance had been a blindfold. preventing Volkov from seeing the threat until it was far too late. 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 moves. It had taken only 4 moves. A profound, deathly silence fell over the park. The flutter of pigeon wings, the laughter of children, the ceaseless hum of the city. All of it was swallowed by the vacuum created by this single, unbelievable moment. No one spoke. No one moved. The crowd was frozen in a state of collective shock, witnesses to an intellectual assassination. The long walk of shame. Maxim Volkov stared at the board, but he was no longer seeing it. The polished wooden pieces, the checkered squares, they had all dissolved into a meaningless blur. In their place, he saw the wreckage of his own monumental pride. His reputation, his carefully constructed aura of invincibility, his very identity as the untouchable genius of the chess world, all of it had been shattered. Not in a hard-fought epic battle against a worthy rival, but here, in a public park, in 4 simple moves, at the hands of a quiet old man he hadn't even considered a real opponent. His face, which had been flushed with the thrill of victory moments before, turned a ghastly white, then a deep, burning crimson of pure humiliation. This was not a loss. A loss was a part of the game. This was a public execution. And his executioner was the gentle, harmless old man he had mocked and belittled. He could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes on him, no longer filled with awe, but with a mixture of pity and stunned disbelief. He could hear the frantic clicking of cameras, capturing this moment of his absolute downfall for eternity. Without a single word, without acknowledging his opponent, Maxim Volkov stood up. His movements were stiff, robotic. As is tradition in a lost game, he reached out and tipped over his own king. The small piece clattered onto the board with a sound that seemed to echo in the profound silence. Then he turned his back on the table, on the crowd, on the ruin of his own making, and walked. He pushed through the stunned circle of his assistants and the silent journalists, a ghost walking away from his own grave. He didn't look back. His long, lonely walk out of the park was the most crushing defeat of his life. The silence that followed his departure was heavier and more profound than the applause he had received all day. As the disgraced Grandmaster disappeared from view, Arthur remained seated, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. He calmly and slowly began to gather his pieces. First the white, then the black, placing each one gently back into its velvet-lined slot within the old wooden box. The crowd watched him, their silence now one of awe and reverence. They looked at the old man, at his worn tweed jacket and his kind, wrinkled face, and they realized they had never really seen him before. They had looked, but they hadn't seen. He closed the lid of his box, poured the last of his tea from his thermos into his cup, and drank it slowly. Then he stood up, adjusted his flat cap, and, leaning on his cane, began his customary slow walk out of the park, leaving a legend in his wake. As he departed, a murmur erupted through the crowd, a wave of excited whispers. A new myth was born that day in the chess corner of Central Park. But what no one there knew, what no one could ever guess, was that this was not the birth of a legend, but merely the faint echo of an old one. They didn't know that the gentle old man they called Arthur was in fact a ghost from a forgotten war. He was a man whose real name was buried in redacted files, a former spy who had spent the height of the Cold War in the smoky cafes of Vienna and the shadowy alleys of East Berlin, a man who had used the arcane language of chess, openings as call signs, gambits as signals, checkmates as final orders, to move secrets and agents across an iron curtain. A man who had played for stakes far higher than any world championship. He was a master strategist whose greatest victory was that the world had never even known he was in the game.